Abdu's small body lay motionless on the cold ground, his eyes closed and his face pale. A faint cry echoed through the empty streets, a desperate plea for help, but no one came, no one heard. Once upon a time, on warm January morning, the sun rose over the small village of Kamuli. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sweetest scent of blooming trees. The sound of birds chirping and children laughing filled the air as the village came to life. And in a small hut on the outskirts of the village, a young boy named Abdu was born. His parents, Tamara and Kuso, gazed lovingly at their newborn son, their faces filled with joy and hope. The family celebrated Abdu's arrival with music, dance, and feasting. As Abdu grew up, he explored the village with wonder, playing in the dusty streets and chasing after goats. He loved listening to his mother's stories and watching his father work in their small garden. He was a bright and curious boy, with eyes that sparkled like the stars and a shy smile that could light up even the saddest person. Tamara and Kuso were young and in love when they got married in a colorful traditional ceremony. Tamara, with her bright smile and sparkling eyes, was a skilled weaver, known for her vibrant fabrics. Kuso, strong and hardworking, was a farmer, tending to their land with care. Together they built a happy life in their nicely decorated hut, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of the village. Tamara would often sing traditional songs while weaving, her voice blending with the rhythms of the village. Kuso would join in, his deep voice harmonizing with Tamara's, creating a joyful atmosphere. A year after their wedding, Abdu was born, and the family spent evenings sharing stories, playing games, and laughing together. But as time passed, challenges arose. The rains failed to come, and Kuso's crops withered. Tamara's weaving also didn't bring in enough income to sustain them. She, however, tried her best to borrow money and do some part-time digging in people's fields in exchange for food for the family. Kuso, on the other hand, had stopped contributing anything to the family, so Tamara held on to support the family for about 4 years. As the challenges mounted, Tamara and Kuso's relationship began to wilt like a flower with months of no water. They argued more frequently, their voices raised in frustration. One morning, as she washed her face, she felt a strange sensation like wanting to throw up. Tamara wondered what it could be. She ignored it for a few weeks, but then it became unbearable, and she was forced to see a midwife who worked in the local clinic. To her shock, she discovered she was 3 months pregnant. This made her panic, knowing how they could barely support their only son, and now she is pregnant. On the other hand, Abdu, their son, started feeling the tension, and his smile slowly started to become less frequent. As time went by, Abdu's life took a tragic turn. His parents, once loving and attentive, became consumed by their problems. They forgot about their son, leaving him to eat in different neighborhoods whenever they were not home. He would stay up late hours in the neighbors' homes until one of them returned home to pick him up. The child started begging for food from neighbors because he couldn't eat the cold leftovers his mother left him in their small hut. As the days turned into weeks, Tamara, previously known for her attentive and nurturing nature, became increasingly distant and preoccupied. Her days were consumed by long hours at the bustling local market, tirelessly trying to sell her meticulously woven creations. This relentless pursuit of income meant Abdu was often left with small leftovers to eat at the neighbor's house, where he sought companionship until the evening shadows grew long. Kuso spent long hours in the fields trying to coax life from the thirsty earth, but nothing worked. He then started going to the bar with friends and returning home late and drunk. Then the once clean and organized hut became cluttered and neglected. Meals were scarce, and Abdu's clothes were torn and most of the time remained unwashed. At the age of 6, he began to feel like he was invisible and his needs and feelings ignored. As they finished their dinner in their small kitchen inside their hut, Tamara and Kuso stood facing each other, their voices raised in anger. Tamara, a petite woman with a fiery spirit, slammed her fist on the counter.
You're never home, Kuso. You're always out with your friends, drinking and laughing, while I'm left to care for Abdu alone.
Kuso, a tall, lanky man with a charming smile, shrugged.
I'm just trying to have a little fun, Tamara. You're always so serious, so uptight.
Fun? Do you call neglecting your family fun? Abdu needs you, Kuso. He needs a father who will be there for him, who will provide and protect him.
Kuso snorted.
You're just jealous because I'm having more fun than you are. You're stuck in this tiny village with no life of your own. I'm out living, Tamara. I'm out living.
Tamara's face wrinkled, tears flowing down her cheeks. She said, "You're killing me, Kuso. You're killing our family." Kuso stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Tamara alone in tears. Tamara sat on the short stool, her head facing down in defeat. She stared blankly at the wall, her mind numb with despair. How had it come to this? She murmured to herself. How did my marriage, once so full of love and laughter, deteriorate to this point? She thought to herself. She thought back to the early days when Kuso and I had been attentive and loving. He had worked hard to provide for their family, and Tamara had been proud to be his wife. But over the years, things have changed. Kuso had started drinking more and more, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Tamara followed him outside and tried to talk to him, to reason with him, but he just laughed and told her she was being too serious. Tamara's tears flowed again, hot and bitter. She felt so alone, so trapped in this miserable marriage. Kuso walked further away from the house and disappeared into the night, feeling free. He told himself, "I have escaped the clutches of a nagging wife and my responsibilities as a father. I can finally relax, finally have some fun. Women can take care of their children even without a man around. She will manage on her own." He headed to the local bar in the nearby village where his friends were waiting for him. They greeted him with cheers and slaps on the back, and Kuso grinned, feeling like the king of the world. He ordered a round of drinks and began to tell stories, laugh, and joke with his friends. He was the life of the party, the center of attention. But as the night wore on, Kuso's laughter began to ring hollow. He was avoiding his problems, avoiding his family. He was running away from his responsibilities, and he knew it. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't face the pain and the anger that awaited him at home. He couldn't face Tamara's tears and Abdu's needs. Meanwhile, Tamara slowly put Abdu to bed, waiting for Kuso to come back after cooling down so they could talk about their problems and find a solution. 3 hours passed, and Kuso had not yet returned. She looked at the time. It was now approaching midnight. Tamara decided to wait a bit longer, thinking maybe he passed by the bar and would return before morning, as he always did. She was awakened by the cocks crowing in the wee hours of the morning. Realizing that Kuso spent a night out of their home, she became more worried. In a moment of desperation, and as she washed her face in the morning, Tamara decided to leave the village to find Kuso and bring him back home. She believed that if she could confront him face to face, she might be able to save their family. She then left Abdu in the care of a kind neighbor, Mrs. Ada, promising to return that evening. Tamara set out on her journey, her heart heavy with worry and determination. She traveled to the neighboring village where she believed Kuso would be, drinking from with his friends, hoping to convince him to come home. But when she got there, she was told that Kuso had just left with Musa, his best friend, and they were headed to the city to find work. The men at the bar told her that if she hurried, she would even find them still waiting for the bus that goes to the city at 11 a.m. every Friday near the main road. Tamara walked and ran through the village path and arrived at the main road. She was sweating profusely like someone who had been involved in a marathon race. Realizing she couldn't make it in time, she decided to stop a motorbike, which in this part of the country is known as boda boda. She told the rider to hurry and drop her at a bus stop that was 5 kilometers away. But as they approached the bus, about 200 meters, disaster struck. The boda boda guy, who was in a rush to catch the bus which was now starting to take off, collided with a car in the corner, and Tamara was involved in a serious accident. Tamara was also pregnant, and so the trauma of the accident left her unconscious, lying in the middle of the road as the bus driver took off. A compassionate car driver passing by stopped and kindly offered to take her to the hospital in the city. As she was unfamiliar to the villagers in the area, none of them had offered to accompany her to the hospital. Gratefully, she accepted the help of the kind driver, who safely transported her to the hospital before continuing on his journey. Unfortunately, by the time the medical staff attended to her, Tamara was in a state of unconsciousness. Her condition was critical, as she had suffered significant blood loss and sustained multiple injuries. A few weeks passed, and Kuso, now settled in the city, remained oblivious to Tamara's accident. He continued to believe that Tamara was at home with their child. His nights were spent in the company of friends and alcohol, and he gave little thought to the responsibilities he had left behind. Meanwhile, back in Kamuli, Mrs. Ada did her best to care for Abdu, but as the days turned into weeks, she became increasingly concerned. Tamara had not returned, and there was no word from her. Abdus's world was shattered when he realized his parents vanished into thin air and were not coming to pick him up as Mrs. Ada promised. Abdus's health then began to decline, the stress of the situation taking a toll on his young body. The once vibrant and curious child was now a tiny, frightened soul, and whenever Mrs. Ada would go to the farm, he would start wandering the empty village paths, calling out for her mother and crying. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Abdu's hope of seeing his parents again began to dwindle, like the fading light of a dying candle. One rainy day, as Abdu was walking home from Mrs. Ada's house to check if his parents were back, he felt dizzy and weak. His small frame couldn't bear the strain any longer. He sat down near the village path, took out a small piece of paper and a pen he always had in his pocket, and scribbled a plea for help.
"Anyone there? Please help me. I can't breathe. I'm feeling dizzy."
His little voice begged, but no one heard or came to his aid, and then he collapsed on the ground. On that fateful day, 2 men who were visitors were running to find shelter due to the rain. Then they saw a child lying down in the middle of the path in the rain. They ran towards him. Abdu's body was found lying on the ground, his eyes closed and his face pale. The 2 visitors were shocked and horrified by the neglect and abandonment that had led to this tragic moment. But as they looked closer, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Abdu's eyes were open, his gaze fixed on something in the distance, and in his small hand he clutched a piece of paper, a message scrawled in childish handwriting.
"Please help me. I'm still alive."
The 2 visitors were filled with shock and uncertainty, finding themselves at a loss for what to do. They had at first believed that Abdu was beyond help, beyond rescue. However, they were astonished to witness his resolute fight and unwavering hope. The sight of such a young child in such a dire state deeply affected them. Without hesitation, they provided him with emergency assistance, all the while attempting to ascertain his identity and place of origin. Wrapping him in warm clothing, they settled him into a bed to rest, hoping that the adverse effects they observed were merely due to the rain. Much to their dismay, as night fell, the child's condition drastically worsened. He became extremely ill, experiencing intense trembling, a soaring fever, and convulsions. They then advised their 72-year-old in-law that it was imperative to transport the child to the nearest hospital. They instructed her to seek out the child's parents in the morning and guide them to the hospital where they had taken him. After furnishing her with the hospital's address, they promptly arranged for transportation and swiftly conveyed the child to the closest medical facility. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Ada frantically realized that young Abdu was nowhere to be found. Panic consumed her as she searched every corner of his usual hangouts, but he was nowhere to be found. She implored everyone she came across if they had caught sight of the little boy, but no one could provide any information. Tears streamed down her face as she grappled with the terrifying prospect of having to explain the disappearance of a child who wasn't her own. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities, from abduction to unspeakable realities. Standing at the threshold of her home, she clung to a glimmer of hope that Abdu would materialize before her eyes, but her anguished wait was in vain. She then braved the strong rains and walked out of the house to alert the chief and other villagers that an Abdu had been missing for over 5 hours. The elders then called a meeting to discuss what could be done to find and care for the child afterward. Meanwhile, Tina, a 72-year-old relative to the two men, woke up early the next morning to go to the village chief to report a child who was found and then taken to the hospital by her guests on their way home. Tragically, while on her way, Tina slipped and fell into a deep pit that had been dug along one of the shortcuts she used, resulting in her unfortunate passing. Meanwhile, Abdu remained in the intensive care unit at the hospital, receiving diligent care from the nurses, while the two men who brought him continued to check on him via phone. They remained hopeful that Abdu's parents would come to the hospital after receiving the message they had left, unaware that the message had not been delivered. 2 weeks later, they received a call from the hospital, with the nurse informing them that Abdu had fully recovered and was ready to go home. As they made their way to the hospital, they pondered over the absence of anyone coming to check on the child, even though they had provided the correct address for the hospital. Elsewhere, Abdu's mother's life was hanging by a thread in the hospital. Strange enough, it happened to be the same hospital where Abdu was hospitalized too. She had thus lost her baby and was still in a coma. The search for the lost boy continued in the village. Thank you for joining me on Abdu's journey of parental neglect and suffering. Tune in next time to African Sunset Folk Tales and find out what happens next. If you enjoyed this story and learned something, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay blessed.